Welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship, the online church ministry of Allegiance to the King. Tonight, I'm going to do a workshop that I was supposed to do at the UCA conference, but some stuff came up and I ended up not being able to go. And so I'm gonna do a workshop tonight on hermeneutics, and I'll explain here in a minute what that means. It's a little different than a normal teaching format where if normally we do the teaching and then we have the Q&A afterwards. I've told the group here tonight that if they have questions or comments or whatever, that go ahead and raise their hands in the middle of it, since it is a workshop and not a normal teaching. So it may be a little bit different in that case if people have questions. So hermeneutics, and subtitle is "What the heck does that mean?" Which, if you know what hermeneutics means, it's a play on words. And this is a little bit of a technical subject, but it's really very dramatically important as a subject. It's really not. It's not a small subject, and it's not an unimportant one. It's very, very important. So even if some of the stuff that I get into tonight seems a little academic or whatever, hang in there, because the deal about this particular subject is that it really can mean the difference between life and death. It can really mean the difference between someone believing something that is true and right and makes them whole and saves them, and something that leads them to destruction. So really, really important subject. All right. So what is hermeneutics? What is that? So hermeneutics is the branch of knowledge. So if you think about all the different kinds of knowledge that deals with interpretation, and especially of the Bible or literary texts. And so this is the Oxford Dictionary's definition of that, and it's a pretty good definition. It basically is the sort of the science of interpretation, and it's a very broad subject, and there's different aspects of hermeneutics and different branches of hermeneutics and all kinds of there's different approaches to it. And we'll talk about, some of that this evening. It comes from the Greek word, actually, that means to explain or to translate. So if you're reading along in 1 Corinthians 12, for instance, and you get down to in the manifestation of the Spirit list there, you get down to speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues. That word interpretation is hermeneia, and that's where we get this word from. So it literally means interpretation. There's a lot of different aspects to hermeneutics. There is categories within hermeneutics of different kinds of things that you're going to deal with, and some of which are very clearly defined and some of which are not very clearly defined. There's different theories and approaches to hermeneutics, where you can have two people doing hermeneutics come away with different interpretations because their theory of hermeneutics is very, very different. And so that makes it challenging. And sometimes complicated. And then there's a lot of different techniques within the study of hermeneutics. So why bother to learn hermeneutics? Why is this important? So let me give you a few things to think about. The first is, have you ever come to realize that you were wrong about your interpretation of something? Maybe you were taught something, and then later on through study, maybe through Bible study, through maybe talking with other people, reading books, and eventually you figure out that what you believed to begin with was wrong. And maybe it was a serious matter. Maybe it wasn't a very important matter, or maybe it was a very serious matter. And so if you've ever come to realize that you were wrong and you changed your interpretation, there was hermeneutics behind that. And there was reasoning behind that change typically. And so that process, whether you really knew what you were doing or not, it helped you to come out of that wrong thinking. Now, the other direction could be true. You might have believed something that was true and then later decided that it wasn't and have a different interpretation. And now you believe something that's actually wrong. And the way in which you're interpreting stuff, which is hermeneutics, it can lead you in the right way if you're doing it in a good and productive way, or if you're doing it in a haphazard and maybe largely you're not even aware of the process, you can end up going in a really bad direction. So it's really important that we understand this subject. And I would say, especially if you're going to teach the Bible, then you have an obligation to learn these things that we're going to learn about tonight. We're not going to go into a lot of depth. We're just going to be touching on some things. And this is really a lifelong pursuit. This is not a college level class that you take for one semester, which you might do. You could do that with hermeneutics, but it's really a lifelong pursuit to get better. This is a skill set, and it's a really important one. If you believe that the Bible is from God, shouldn't you work hard to get a correct understanding of it? Right? Well, yeah, obviously, if you believe the Bible's from God, then it's really, really, really important to get at an accurate understanding of what God is saying. And obviously, we know that there's lots of understandings that can't possibly be accurate because there's lots of different understandings on the same subject, and they can't all be right. And so how do you get to that place where you know, okay, no, I am actually believing the right thing? Some people believe that, well, I pray and trust that the Holy Spirit's going to lead me in the right direction, and that I will have a sense in my spirit that I believe the right thing. Well, the problem with that approach is that you can have two people very, very sincerely believing that the Holy Spirit has led them to the conclusion that they have, and they have totally opposing views. Well, okay, they can't both be listening to the Holy Spirit, right? That if they have contradictory views, then the Holy Spirit is contradicting, right? Clearly that can't be the case. So either one or both of them are not actually listening to the Holy Spirit. My experience is that the Holy Spirit will help us through this process, but isn't just going to give us the answers. God just doesn't download the answer. There you go. There's the answer. He expects us to work at this. He's looking for active faith, and active faith involves work. It involves the work of study. Jesus was teaching his disciples, right? And think about this. He was teaching all these people, and he would use a parable. And why did he use a parable? It says that he used parables so that they wouldn't understand, right? Well, wait a minute. And he would end a lot of his teachings with, those who have ears to hear, let them hear, right? What's going on? Well, the disciples that hang around and really want to know, he would tell them, it's for you to understand, right? So God is he's looking for people who will press in and do the hard work of learning, right? And so it's important, if you believe that the Bible is from God, that this is an important skill set to learn. It's really something that you don't want to neglect. And some people are going to do more learning and study in the subject of hermeneutics than others, but I believe any sincere Christian that really wants to prioritize their understanding of the Bible, they need to learn at least some of these skills. And then finally, we don't like it when people misinterpret us. If I say something to you guys, and later on, Inti's talking to somebody else, he's like, I can't believe John was saying such and such the other day. And, and he's totally misinterpreted me. Well, I don't like that. I need to get together with Inti and, hey, why did you think I was saying that? Oh, well, that's what I thought you said. And, oh, no, this is what I'm saying. Oh, okay. and we straighten it out, right? We don't just let that go. And if we love each other, obviously we work those things out. Well, so we don't like it when someone is misinterpreting us. Well, how do you think God feels about that? I don't think God likes it either. That makes sense. And so if God doesn't want us to misinterpret him, and hermeneutics is the study and the process, the how of interpretation, then clearly this is an important subject and it's worth our time and effort to get good at it. The other thing is that divisions stem frequently from hermeneutics, and that can be from a lack of good hermeneutics. Maybe the process by which someone is interpreting is very, very faulty. For example, I could be reading the Bible and I'm just going on whatever I think it means. There's no process involved. There's no check and balance. There's no study. I'm just reading, and whatever I think it means and says, that's what I'm going with, right? Well, if I do that, I am almost certainly going to have lots of wrong interpretations, all the way to, no, I have careful hermeneutics, but my hermeneutics, some of which at least, differ from another person. And so because we have a different set of hermeneutics, we are coming to different interpretive conclusions. Okay, well, how do you evaluate that then, right? Well, you have to actually understand the differences between the hermeneutics, and you have to actually determine in those differences which one seems more legitimate for understanding the Bible. And so it's possible, even with hermeneutics, to have differences and divisions. And so we want to understand what are these differences that create these divisions. Different hermeneutics is actually why we have so many denominations, because people will come to different conclusions, different interpretations, and they will end up making a new a whole new denomination. So frequently we don't understand each other because we use different ways of interpreting. And again, for a lot of folks, that actually means a difference of doing things in a way that you haven't even really thought through, that you're just acting upon maybe what you were taught, or that kind of thing. Also, these divisions get created because I would say most people don't understand the actual interpretive process that they're using, and they fail to learn proper techniques. And so what happens is they read on instinct, and especially through filters that they have been taught. So they were taught particular ways of understanding the Bible. They were taught particular doctrines, and this doctrine is true, all others are false, and they just believe that. And so as they read along, we've all done this. I certainly have done this, and we just read it. So we're not even aware of the process, and we don't. We're not cognizant of the fact that we're interpreting things in maybe illegitimate ways. I like to call the process of interpretation doing calculus in your head. That interpretation is wildly complex, but we grow up learning to interpret things on the fly without really thinking about them too much. And the reality is that interpretation is really, really, really hard work. And there's a lot to it. You're going to see it in a later slide, just how big the process actually is when done legitimately. And so if you think about calculus, for instance, as an analogy, that that if you're going to do calculus and you're, let's say that you're going to solve a problem, and let's assume that you know how to do calculus. If you were start to work on that problem, and you're going to just do that in your head, that's all you're going to do. You're not going to write it down or anything like that. You're going to have a very, very difficult time solving that problem. Very difficult time solving that problem. If you've got a piece of paper, on the other hand, or a computer you're going to type into, you start to write down the problem and you're working through it, and you can see how that's building through to the actual result, then you can do it. Well, the dirty little secret is that interpretation is wildly more complex than calculus. It's just that it's a process that can be done very, very poorly without our realizing it. And so we end up doing this calculus in our heads and actually failing at it very, very miserably, and ending up with wildly wrong ideas about what we're reading. So we don't want to do that. And that, all of that leads to a lot of divisions. Another concept that affects our interpretation is it's a process I like to call being in love with my bias. And I use this being in love analogy because it sort of fits nicely with what happens. So first, so let's talk about being in love and the things that happen when someone falls in love, right? So first of all, we have this saying that's pretty common. I don't know if this is all cultures have this, but we have this saying in the West: love is blind, right? And you know what that means, right? That it means that we sort of, we don't really see what's maybe not so great about that person, right? And we don't care, right? We're just totally blind. We don't care at all, right? And so bias has that same effect. We just don't even see the other possibilities. We're completely blind to it because of our bias. Second is, love can do no wrong, even when it does. So if you think about this, and you've probably either experienced this or you've known people who've experienced this, where they fall in love with someone who's really not a good person and who may be actually abusive and awful. And maybe this is a friend of yours, and you try to talk to your friend about it, about, this behavior of this person is not good and wrong. And they start making excuses. Right? Oh, no, you just don't understand. It's not a big deal, or I think you're just misinterpreting that, and those sorts of things, right? And we've all experienced this sort of thing. And so that when we fall in love, that can happen, right? Well, bias is just like that, where somebody can come along and say, well, that this thing that you're interpreting, that you're saying, it doesn't even make any kind of logical sense. And look, it's contradicting this other verse over here. And well, no, you're just not understanding. And you're, this is definitely the right way. And this is, and so on and so forth. And so you have this whole situation where you could be totally wrong, but you're blind to it and you're making excuses about it, right? And so again, love is like bias sometimes. Next, we go to kind of this next stage. In this love, okay, we've got problems, and maybe they're pretty difficult problems, but I'm too invested into the relationship to give up now, right? And so we've known people like that. They've dated a person for a number of years, and they're still not married because the other person doesn't want to commit, and but they're too invested in this relationship. So they're not ready to give up on it yet, right? Even though maybe the other person has really demonstrated their lack of commitment to this relationship. Same thing in a marriage. You can have a marriage that is really dysfunctional and abusive and stuff like that, but the person feels like they've invested too much into this relationship to give up on it now. And so, how does this relate to bias? What happens is, over time, those biases become deep rooted into our lives. You can think about if you're, let's say, a scientist or a professor who has made a career on a particular theory. Maybe you've written books and papers and you've taught lectures at conferences, and you've taught classes for years on this, and you wrote a dissertation. Your PhD was built around this theory and all this kind of stuff, and you've been doing that for 20 years. And somebody comes along and they're poking holes in your theory, right? Well, the tendency is certainly going to be, and understandable, you're going to defend your theory. You're going to fight tooth and nail. You're going to want to say, no, you're just not seeing this properly, and you're going to work hard to debunk the objections, or you're going to ignore them. And in a lot of cases, this unfortunately happens all too often in circles like academics, where the fight that's put up doesn't even have to do with the merits of the arguments. It, basically politics works into it, where, well, if you question this prevailing theory, even with data, that, you'll get fired. You won't be able to get a job. You'll be ridiculed, that kind of stuff. And so our biases can make us fight against truth coming at us, because we're too invested into those ways of believing and interpreting that we've always had. And then finally, being in love, maybe, with this dysfunctional relationship, we have the breakup, right? And what some people do, not everybody does this, but what some people do is, after the breakup, they say, I'll never love again. It's too painful. It's, it's not worth it, right? And what I've seen sometimes with people and their bias, if they've gone for many, many years with that bias, and then for one reason or another, that view is sort of completely obliterated, rather than being the truth seeker that they need to be and saying, oh, okay, well, I'm glad to be out of this wrong way of thinking into this better way of thinking, or this right way of thinking, interpreting and understanding. Instead of doing that, they just throw their hands up and say, well, nobody can really know, right? I've seen this happen most frequently when the bias is tied not to the Bible or a particular interpretation, but rather to a denomination, a church, a group of people, where the bias is actually integrated into that organization, and the organization itself blows up, and they, and they just kind of go off on their own. They walk away. And, I think I've certainly experienced having disruption in my spiritual life and community. I've left more than one organization over changes in interpretation, and didn't want to do that, but had to. And, but I've never felt the sense of, oh, it's just, nobody can know, and give up and stuff like that. And that's because from nearly the beginning of my walk in my faith, at least when I got serious, I've tried to grow in my abilities to interpret, to understand, because I had an attitude, and I think this is the right attitude to have, of I'm definitely wrong about some things. I don't know what they are. I want to learn and grow, and I believe that God will honor that pursuit and help me to grow into truth. So I should expect that I'm going to be overturning old ways of thinking that turn out not to be correct in terms of how I'm interpreting the Bible. The other analogy that I like to use for this whole process that I think is helpful in understanding the importance of doing hermeneutics and growing hermeneutics is the analogy of building a house. Okay, so you're going to build a house. You have to have a plan for the house. You have to have building materials. You have to have tools to build with, and you have to have a skill set for using the tools to take the materials according to the plan and build the house, right? The end goal is a house that you can occupy, right? That you can live in, that's comfortable and is going to be easy to maintain, and this isn't all leaky and falling down and that kind of stuff. And so, all right, so with that sort of analogy in mind, I want you to imagine, because hermeneutics is the process of interpretation really isn't that different. It involves all of those guys, the plan. It's sort of the fundamentals and basics and theories of hermeneutics. And then you've got tools within hermeneutics. You have to have a skill set in hermeneutics. The materials are the scriptures. And you're going to go through that process. The end goal, instead of a house, is the truth. You want to get to the truth. So if you think about building a house, I want you to imagine building a house with no tools. Maybe you have a plan, and maybe you have the building materials. Maybe you even have a skill set, but there are no tools, right? So you're going to cut some wood with your bare hands. That's not going to work very well, right? Or you're going to nail down a roof and you're going to try and push the nails in with your thumb. Well, obviously that's really dumb, right? So you have to have tools, and you better have the right tool for the right job, right? Or else it's going to be a mess. Next, you've got to build the house. What if you were to build the house with the wrong tools? So you have tools, but you're not using the right tool, right? So for example, you're going to cut the wood, but you're going to use a hammer to do it, right? Well, that would be dumb, right? But this is what happens in hermeneutics, is that people will use the wrong tools for interpreting, right? They'll use a tool that was meant for something different to make an interpretation about something, or they won't have a tool for some particular interpretation that they really need to have for getting that out of that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. What if you were building a house with tools that you don't know how to use? So maybe you even have the right tools, but you don't actually know how to use those tools. So, think about, for example, you're going to frame a house, but you don't really know how to frame. You don't know how to make the right cuts to make the frame work right. Maybe you even have building plans, but you don't know how to read the building plans. And so you're going to make a mess of things. The end result, people will be able to look at it, and in a house, they can look at it and they can go, wow, you didn't know what you were doing. That was a terrible, terrible job. Well, the problem with interpretation is we can have a really terrible house that's really difficult to live in, and but we live in it anyway, and we think it's a perfectly good house when it's actually a really terrible house. So it's a little insidious, but we need to be able to build a house with the right tools that we know how to use, and doing it properly. And that's really the only way to build a house that you can actually live in. Well, in terms of hermeneutics, it's doing those things, having the right tools, knowing how to use them, using them properly, all that kind of good stuff, and largely having a plan as well. It's the only way to actually get to a correct interpretation. And so kind of important. Now, one of the problems with hermeneutics is that it's a very good sleep aid. This is a rather boring subject. I'm using these analogies, love and building a house and stuff like that, because I've learned over the years that teaching hermeneutics is very effective at getting people to leave the room. It's a boring subject. I'm sorry, but it is, right? But it's really, really, really important. And so, we need to move past that. And and I've actually had this happen, right? So years ago, I was teaching this was where a number of churches, local churches in a city that I used to live in, came together, and they would come together, I think, once a month, and we'd have kind of a joint meeting. And I can remember I decided that it was my turn to teach, and I was really, I was heavy into, at the time, logical fallacies, and learning to recognize logical fallacies, how to pick them out, and how to see them, and how to show why this particular logic was in error. And so I said, okay, so I put together what I thought would be kind of a fun teaching on logical fallacies. And within 10 minutes of teaching, I actually had people getting up and walking out. Because it really is, it can be kind of nerdy stuff. And sometimes it can be a little boring. But you know what? Sometimes you got to do hard work in order to get the result, right? If you're trying to get in shape, right, you got to eat right, and you got to exercise. And sometimes you just don't want to, right? I've got to go to the gym. I don't want to go to the gym. I'd rather watch TV, right? I'd rather just get a burger from the fast food place instead of trying to find a healthy meal, right? Or making a healthy meal, right? I just have order a pizza. Well, I'm not going to get the end result if I'm not willing to do hard work that sometimes may not even be fun, may just be hard work. So one of the things that I found, and I think this is true for most things that are like this, that it's more about the doing of it than it is the knowing, right? For example, let's go back to our being in shape or exercise and that kind of thing. You can know a lot about health and be very unhealthy. I bet you most of you have probably been to a doctor that wasn't in very good health. Maybe they were very overweight, and they kind of looked sickly and stuff like that. As a doctor, right? And I've actually, in my business, I've worked a lot with physicians, and I remember a weight loss doctor one time that I was doing some work for, who was overweight. And I thought, wow, now he was helping people, right, to lose weight, but he himself wasn't doing it, right? And you think about too, I like this particular saying: never take financial advice from someone who's always been poor. It makes sense, if you study martial arts, right, you can read books about martial arts. You can watch people doing martial arts, and you can learn the names of the techniques, and you can learn head knowledge about the technique. But I guarantee you, if you actually had to use them, you'd never be able to use them until you actually do it and you practice. And what I have found is that as you begin to practice, it's pretty hard to practice, right? At the beginning. So if you're learning a musical instrument, for instance, you're probably terrible at it to begin with. And it's hard to make yourself, maybe you're just going to do scales, and it's hard to make yourself do scales. But if you'll do it and you work at it, the more you do it, the more you want to do it. The more you get better at it, the more you want to do it, the more fun it becomes. And interpretation is like that. When you're actually going to do good work in hermeneutics, it's hard at first because there's a lot to learn and a lot to practice, and some of it's kind of tedious. But the more you do it, the better you get at it, the more fun it becomes. And so it's really not doing that. So it's not different than that. So you want to learn the process and the tools. Certainly, you got to have some head knowledge, but the best way to do hermeneutics, to get good at it, to learn and to love it, is to do it, to practice it and do it and do it and do it. Okay, I'm going to get into, we're not actually going to do hermeneutics tonight. It would take a whole, I mean, we would spend weeks on one subject, but I do want to go through sort of at a high level a number of the tools, and I've put these largely in what I believe is a flow of order. That when you go through the interpretive process, these tools are sort of in this arrangement as you go to get to that correct interpretation. So the first one is the fundamentals of logic, and this is really sort of just a basic foundation. This understanding how to do good logic and argumentation sort of works through the whole process. If you are not good at sound logic, the rest of this is a lot more difficult to be good at. You can do it, but you're probably going to be making mistakes and errors in your thinking that you're not even aware of. So the fundamentals of logic are kind of always there. This is an important tool to trade, and it's important to at least have a basic understanding of how good logic works. Second is biblical theology. And you may have heard this term before. There's sort of two terms kind of thrown out there: systematic theology and biblical theology. And we'll get to systematic theology later in the list. Biblical theology is basically understanding the story, right, of the Bible. It's I start in Genesis and I read through the Bible and I'm understanding the narrative of the scriptures. If I were doing hermeneutics in some other book, it would be the same thing. So let's say a Charles Dickens novel, and I'm going to do hermeneutics on this Charles Dickens novel, or maybe some ancient Greek novel, some Homer poem or something like that. One of the fundamentals that I begin with is I read through it and understand the story. I need to kind of get the whole picture before I'm going to dive in deeper. And so biblical theology is building theology through the narrative of the scriptures, so through understanding the story itself. Next is understanding literary genre. So the Bible is, unlike most other books, is a collection of books that it has a lot of different genres. So here's a few. You've got narrative, like some of the history books, like Acts, for instance, is a narrative. Then you've got poetry, like the Psalms. You've got biography, like the Gospels. And you've got epistles, like the letters of Paul, that sort of thing. And the deal is that you need to understand the differences between these genres and others. I haven't named all of them. And understand when I'm reading in a particular genre, I don't want to apply the same thinking and methodologies from a different genre. So let me give you an example of this. I don't want to apply the same interpretive approach to a sci-fi novel that I would to a scientific textbook, right? I'm not going to go to the sci-fi novel and read it like a scientific textbook, where I'm going to assume that, oh, warp drive. Okay, this is a scientific fact, right? You know, I, no one would do that, right? We all understand different genres and we read them differently, right? Well, the Bible has different genres, and you don't want to read the different genres in some way outside of how that genre is supposed to be read. More importantly, modern genre versions of these, like biography and narrative and epistles and things like that, is different than ancient versions of those genres. And I need to understand the literary genres as they were understood when they were written. And they are definitely different. And so there's learning that has to take place for that. Then you've got literary devices, and this is a broad category. I've just given you a few things here, but you have literary devices, and you need to understand those devices because they will help you to interpret. So I've listed off a few here. Idioms, for instance, cultural sayings, that the saying means something other than the words being used. And I was using one the other day of kick the bucket. And kick the bucket is a phrase. I don't, if for those of you maybe listening to this from other places that don't use this idiom, kick the bucket means to die, that somebody has died, right? Well, clearly the words kick the bucket, just the words, don't have anything to do with dying. But that's an idiom, right? That's how all idioms work, is there's a meaning applied to the saying that isn't the saying. And so idioms, metaphors, proverbs, parables. Proverbs, for instance, a proverb is a truthism. It's not a formula, right? So when you're reading some proverb, you don't want to treat it like some sort of like a recipe for a particular dish of food that you're going to make. That's not what and if you make it that way, it always comes out the same. That's not how proverbs work. They're truthisms. They're generally true, and we generally want to follow these proverbs. They're good sayings, they're warnings and things like that, but they're not intended to be some sort of scientific formula. So there's a lot of different types of literary devices, and the more that you are aware of and the more that you understand them, the better in terms of how you can then interpret. It's important also to remember that just like in literary genres, literary devices today are not necessarily the same as literary devices in the ancient past. And so you need to understand the literary devices as they were understood when they were written. And again, that takes work to get to that place where you understand that. Historical cultural analysis. So this is where you have to get into culture and history and understanding when it was written, the people who wrote it and the people it was written to had particular historical things going on and particular cultural things going on that affect the proper interpretation of what you're reading. And so you've got to have some background in that. If you're going to study a particular book of the Bible, you need to know the context of the culture and the history in which it was written, because it will impact the interpretation of that. And if you don't understand that background, you can easily misinterpret. Contextual analysis. And remember, I'm giving you these tools of the hermeneutical trade in a particular order. That this is sort of the order you need to kind of build it when doing good hermeneutics. Contextual analysis is reading through the context a particular passage falls in. So that could be the book that you're dealing with. So let's say you're dealing with Galatians, for instance, right? Well, the context of Galatians is the whole book, but within that book, there may be subsections that there's a context in a smaller context within the larger context of that book. So for example, In 1 Corinthians, chapters 12, 13, and 14 make up a single unit on the subject of spiritual matters. And that's the topic of those 3 chapters. So you want to understand anything inside those 3 chapters in light of the fact that Paul is writing about spiritual matters. But that section falls within the context of the whole letter, which is dealing with divisions in the church, right? So you've also got the context of divisions in the church occurring in 12, 13, and 14. So contextual analysis leads you to a good understanding of what's going on around the particular verse or passage that you're dealing with. Then you have what's called lexical syntactical analysis. These are fancy words that just mean words and sentences, right? So the lexical, that's your words and the meanings of words and how they were used and how they'd be used in different contexts and that kind of stuff. And then syntactical is how the sentences are coming together to provide meaning. And this is and a lot of these you can just read about, you can read about history and culture and you can learn things, right? This is a little trickier. Building vocabulary is everybody knows if you're going to learn another language, you got to build your vocabulary, and that can be a little bit of a tedious process, but it's an important process. And it's important to remember that words and sentences were different in the languages of the Bible. They didn't work like our language and or your language. Even if your language is different, I guarantee you your language is different than the ones that were written in the Bible. So when you're reading an English translation, they're trying to help and they're giving you their translation of the word and their translation of the sentences and paragraphs and the punctuation and all that kind of stuff. But it's impossible to be 100% accurate with that stuff. It doesn't work that way. Words don't translate exactly. The sentences can't come together exactly the same way, right? For instance, Paul has a number of times where he writes a sentence that takes up 10, 12 verses, single sentence. Well, there's purpose behind that, but you would never have that in English. You're not going to write it that way. You're going to have sentences and paragraphs and stuff like that kind of broken out. It's not going to reflect it, but you just can't really bring it across very well. But if you're doing hermeneutics, you need to become aware of those things and you need to understand, well, this particular word, this is one of my favorites, is in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12. You see that, it says, I don't permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And the word authority there, it's the only time that particular word appears in the New Testament, the Greek New Testament. It's the Greek word authentoo, and it's a bizarre word. It has this really broad range of meaning, including murder, suicide, authorship, a number of different meanings that and one of them is to usurp authority, and it's probably what that is going on in that verse. But you've got this wildly different meaning. Well, if you don't know that, and the translator has had to make a choice, they could be wrong about their choices, and you wouldn't know that if you're not doing this kind of analysis. Another one, and this is a tough one, is the New Testament use of verses from the Old Testament. This is really tricky stuff, because when you read a New Testament author using the Old Testament and in a particular way, and then you go back and read the Old Testament, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. What? How did he get that? I think of Matthew, for instance, when Matthew is quoting Isaiah and, is talking about the virgin will be with child and talking about Jesus, right? And then you go back and you read Isaiah and you realize, wait a minute, that's not first of all, it's not really talking about a virgin, and it's talking about a kid who's going to be born at that time. Okay, well, why is Matthew using that verse as a fulfillment of the scriptures in Jesus? Okay, well, this is a very important subject. If you take a book like Hebrews, for instance, that's got a bunch of quotes of the Old Testament, if you don't understand how an author is utilizing verses from the Old Testament, because they may not be using it the way you and I would use it, right? We may think, especially in our sort of modern Enlightenment scientific world approaches to things, we want that Old Testament verse to be used correctly and accurately in the New Testament, right? Well, they may not care about that at all. They have some other purpose in mind of why they're using it. And if you don't understand the New Testament author's usages, then you can easily be led astray in terms of interpreting those sections. So, which it's a big subject and takes a while to learn. Theological analysis. So we're finally at systematic theology. And I want to stop on this and make a quick note that I find that the way most people do the interpretive process is they learn a particular system of theology, and when they go to interpret the scriptures, they begin with that instead of the fundamentals of logic and biblical theology and genre and cultural analysis, all those kind of things. They start with systematic theology, and this is a really bad approach to interpretation, because you're basically coming to it deciding to begin with how this thing is going to work, what it's going to mean. Right? You're going to read it. If you, for instance, if you believe that the word mystery, you've been taught in your systematic theology that the word mystery means that it was not known until this person who's writing about it revealed it. If that's what you believe about that word, because you were taught that in your systematic theology, you definitely will interpret wrong, because that's not what that concept means. It doesn't mean that. And so I'm not going to give you what it means right now. That's a whole nother teaching. But you're definitely going to get it wrong. So you don't want to start with your systematic theology. If you have a particular view of, say, salvation, for instance, and you're going to go and interpret a particular passage, you don't want to start with your view of salvation. That is using systematic theology improperly. And what happens is you'll never get over your biases. The way you get over your biases is to leave the systematic theology for the end, right? You do all this other stuff so that by the time you get to the systematic theology, that system that you've been taught and you have of what the interpretation of subjects is in the scriptures, when you get to that point, you will have done enough work to recognize when the thing that you have in your system is wrong. That I've done all this work and it absolutely does not line up with my bias. Okay, now I can take a step back and I'm going to have to rethink. Something's wrong in my what I was taught or what I believed, that kind of thing. The other thing about theological analysis that's important is original theology, right? We don't want to interpret based upon modern theology. We want to, or even over church history theology, we want to interpret according to the theology of the time of the authors, right? So, for example, here's a big one. One of the reasons that we want to reject the Trinity is because the authors didn't have that theology. That came hundreds of years later, right? And so they're bringing all kinds of things into the scriptures that were not part of the theology of the original writers. So we want to be careful to make sure that we can definitely show a theological interpretation was an interpretation of the original writers and not something that came along later. So, for example, I don't want to come up with a theology that there's nobody in the Bible teaching that theology. Again, the Trinity is a good example of this. Nobody's teaching it. There's nowhere is that taught in the Bible anywhere. Okay, then that's a theology that's later being brought in that doesn't exist in the scriptures. And so we want to be careful about that. And then after all of that, I can finally get to application. If I skip all of that hard work and jump to application, I almost certainly will misapply the scriptures. And there's several different ways that you can see a correct interpretation becoming good application. It can be devotional, where it's, helping us in terms of our devotional life with God. It can be cultural, how we're living out our lives in community, in society. It can be theological. It can be an understanding of truth about God, about the world, about people, those sorts of things. And all of those are fine, but we won't want to jump to application. We need to come to a correct interpretation of the passage, of the book, of the verse, whatever it is, a correct interpretation before we move to application. Okay, so let me wrap up with giving you some resources. And I'm just going to give you a few here. These are some stuff that some of the books that I've read and things like that. And there's a lot of different, I could put a lot of different things in here. So I don't want you to think that like, oh, well, here's the best books on the subject. That's not what I'm giving you. I'm just giving you some samples. So here's a couple of books on biblical hermeneutics. The one on the top there that you'd really treat as a textbook. And it's basically principles and was it processes and read up here. Yeah, processes of biblical interpretation. And it's got a lot of good stuff in it. The second book is one of these, multiple views book. This is a 5 views book on biblical hermeneutics. This is a really great one to start with if you've never really been exposed to the subject before, because you're going to see all these different approaches, and you'll immediately start to see there's good approaches and there's bad approaches in your own mind, the way you think about it, right? But you might actually be surprised, right? I remember when I first got this book and I looked through the contents and I saw that one of the hermeneutical essays in it was the approach of interpretation based from the reader's standpoint rather than the author's standpoint. I think we typically think of a correct interpretation means getting back to what the author actually meant, right? And generally, I think that's very true, right? There's a whole discipline approach in hermeneutics that says, no. The interpretation is always with the reader. And so it's all about the reader's process of interpretation of how they are going to understand this. And it's not about the author. And when I first saw that was going to be one of the essays, I thought, oh, well, that's going to be one I disagree with wholeheartedly. And then I read the essay and I was like, you know what? There's some really useful stuff in here. And I may not agree with everything, but it was surprising to me. Anyway, it's a good book to kind of get you started if you're going to dive into this stuff. Books on theological frameworks. So I didn't really go into theological frameworks in this. Theological frameworks are it's hard to pin them down into a particular thing, but this is dispensationalism and covenantalism and stuff like that. There's only a few of them, but they're really, really important in the process of interpretation. You can basically think of it as sort of a paradigm of how I'm approaching the scripture to kind of see it put together. It typically involves biblical theology and how I'm going to understand the story and that kind of thing. It affects things like what do I apply to myself in the story and those kind of things. And so these are really, really important to become familiar with. It's good to know what you've been taught and understanding your own ideas about it. Well, let me go back there. It's just a couple of books. I think these are both really good. You can get like multiple views books about this as well. But these were in particular really good books. The Progressive Dispensationalism has an excellent first part on the history of dispensationalism, and Progressive Covenantalism. I think largely is the best theological framework. Study history and culture. You need to just this is not complicated. It's just a lot of reading, or listening to books, or there'll be YouTube videos you can watch on history and culture as well, and just familiarizing yourself with Eastern culture and Middle Eastern history, biblical history, Roman history, all that kind of good stuff, and the culture in which the books of the Bible were written. I'll give you a couple of things here. This is an interesting Bible. I've got a copy of this Bible. It's the Cultural Background Study Bible. And so as you go through the Bible, they're giving you big sections that go along with the passages that talk about cultural background stuff associated with that. So it's pretty cool. And then Bible dictionaries. I've given you one example here, Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary. Bible dictionaries are basically encyclopedias of the Bible. And so they're organized by subject, and there's a lot of cultural background stuff typically in Bible dictionaries. So having some good Bible dictionaries is always helpful in learning. And that's an ever learning process. I've been studying biblical history and biblical culture for 30 years, and I still learn things all the time. You got to learn to use some language tools. And I've given you a couple of things here. There's certainly great software tools these days, but they're, even within those, you need to learn some things. I recommend that anybody who wants to actually study the Bible, especially the New Testament, is to get this book right here by get back to it. Greek for the Rest of Us. It's an excellent sort of primer to the Koine Greek language. And even if you don't want to go so far as to actually learn biblical Greek in its entirety, it's a really good idea to read this book. It will definitely help your study of the languages. And then you need to learn to use tools like lexicons, and to understand how they work. So, a lot of them are pretty technical, and you need to kind of learn how to navigate through that. There'll be a lot of Greek in it, and if you don't read Greek, you're not going to be able to read that. There's lots of abbreviation and quotes and stuff like that. But once you kind of get used to them, they're pretty easy to use. And this particular one is a more modern one. You want to definitely use more modern tools. I would say, when it comes to language tools, especially, I really wouldn't recommend one that's more than 30 years old. Anything under 30 is going to be pretty good. And primarily these days, as far as lexicons go, I use 3 different lexicons that are all dated to the 21st century. And the reason for that is that there's just been way too much advancement in the understanding of the languages in the last few decades to utilize older tools. And then finally, you got to study logic. And this actually can be more fun than it sounds. I recommend this book. And this is a great book to use with your kids too, The Fallacy Detective. It's a great little book. It's helpful. It's kind of a fun read, and you'll learn a lot. And even if logic is one of those subjects that's gigantic and can get highly technical, but you don't need that for good hermeneutics. If you learn some basics, learn a lot about fallacies and stuff like that, which this is a fun book for that. You'll have a good working understanding. The other one I've got there is Exegetical Fallacies by D.A. Carson. This is a really good book to as you start to get into Bible interpretation, to be familiar with his list of exegetical fallacies. Exegetical just means you're interpreting the scriptures, and the fallacies are your approach to how you're interpreting is flawed logically. And so you're almost certainly wrong in your interpretations. And so it's not a long book, but it's good to familiarize yourself with. Well, I said this was going to be a workshop and that I'd answer questions along the way, but no one raised their hand. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions after all that nonsense. Yeah, NT.
So I was at the let me put my hand down. I was at the UCA conference, and I was had met this guy named James. He works with Jerry Weirwool and John Shane High with the REV translation. And I was in their workshop because I was just curious, because I don't know much about hermeneutics at all. But what I found was that apparently the Strong's, is it a lexicon or is it concordance? Or is it both? I don't know.
Strong's has both. It has
Okay.
a kind of a limited lexicon, and then it's primarily a concordance.
Lexicon's Hebrew and concordance is Greek, right?
No. Lexicon is a fancy word for dictionary.
Okay.
And a concordance is basically kind of like an index. It's basically, here's all the places where that word appears in the Bible, that kind of thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was asking them about the lexicon because apparently a lot of the lexicons out there, like Strong's, are based on really old data. Like Strong's uses King James documents from what they had back in the medieval ages or in the Renaissance or whatever. And they only had and I've known this for a while, but they only had a couple dozen original manuscripts and then another dozen of Latin manuscripts. So they had nothing compared to the over 2,000 or 3,000 we have today. I forget how much we have.
It's over 5,000.
Okay, well, anyhow, it's obviously different. Do you have any suggestions in general? What kind of lexicons to go to? Because I wouldn't want to just jump on. Is BDAG
the BDAG, and I think it's the 3rd edition, is the newer one, and that's an excellent lexicon. It's what's called a biblical lexicon. So it's only giving you words that appear in the Bible, and it's only giving you the definitions that the editors believe actually appear in the Bible, that are actually used in the Bible. So, for instance, if you go to the BDAG entry on authentoo that I talked about earlier, you're not going to get all the definitions in the BDAG. It's a very good lexicon, and it's very helpful. It's just limited to the editor's views about what's in the Bible, and for the vast majority of it, they're absolutely going to be right. But it is possible for them to be wrong. And there's several more modern lexicons that are Greek language lexicons. So that the newer version of the Liddell Scott, the Brill, and there was one that came out last year from I think it's the Cambridge lexicon.
Okay, I was curious because they use, so many people quote Strong's, and that's based on a handful of documents compared to what.
Well, it's not that, most of the time Strong's, the dictionary in Strong's is going to be fine. It's just, you'd want to be careful if you're really digging in deep. You don't want to use the Strong's. You need to use something more than the Strong's. But I wouldn't say the Strong's is inaccurate in its definitions. Largely, it's more that it's too limited.
Yeah, that's the one I cut my teeth on, because in way ministry, that's all they shoved down your throat. So who knew, right? I didn't. I'll wait until Linty's done, because I did have something to ask. I had two things. but I forgot the other one that I wanted to ask.
All right, well, let's see. NT, did you?
Were you done, NT, or what?
Yes, I'm done.
Okay. Go ahead, Donna.
Well, now I forgot. Ugh. Anyways, it had something to do with the original. Oh, well, I want to ask that one. Would you be willing to give just a brief I know this is just the theological frameworks. I know what progressive covenantalism, I've read that, but what is progressive dispensationalism? What is that?
So they're actually pretty close to each other. Progressive dispensationalists agree that the covenants are largely how you need to divide up the scriptures. Where they differ from progressive covenantalists is progressive dispensationalists do maintain that the nation of Israel, ethnic Israel,
Right.
still has a kind of a distinct plan in God's plan, as opposed to covenantalists typically have the view, no, there was one plan, it is Israel's plan, and the Gentiles got added to it, and that's the plan of the new covenant. And so that's largely where they differ. You'll also find that typically progressive covenantalists are amillennial, so they don't believe in a millennial kingdom.
Really?
Whereas progressive dispensationalists typically do believe in a millennial kingdom.
Yeah.
But otherwise, other than that, they're pretty similar.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, John, it's Dan.
Hey, Dan.
Just a little off the subject, but would you care to expound a little bit on your statement about the word mystery?
Oh, sure. So it's a translation of the Greek word mysterion, and mysterion means something that was certainly unknown at one time, but has partially been revealed, and to one degree or another is unfolding. And it's actually it doesn't, when we use the word mystery, we mean something that you can't really know, right? That it's a mystery. Nobody knows, right? And so that's definitely that's a terrible translation of that particular word. But it's also not a good idea to translate it secret, because even though it's a little more like a secret, that really doesn't capture the sense of how they're using this word in the language. So outside of the Bible, mysterion was typically talking about the secrets within a say a religious order that you would learn as you moved through that religious order. So for example, use the Masons as an example, right? You've got these orders of Masons, and as you move up in the order, you get revealed secrets as you go, right? And so it kind of has that sense in the culture. But if you do a study of how this is being used in the Bible, what you find is that what it's referencing is sort of, God's plans that he's sort of revealing out over time, and things will get called this mystery that have been known for a long time, right? And it's just not everybody knows it. So let me give you some examples. Mm-hmm. The Messiah is called a mystery in the New Testament, right? And the mystery of the Messiah. But clearly they knew a Messiah was coming for a really long time. They didn't know who it was going to be until Jesus. So you can see this, what it's talking about when it says partially known, but not fully known. They knew there was a Messiah coming. They knew some things about the Messiah. Originally they just knew it was going to be a prophet like Moses, right? Later they know it's going to be a descendant of David, that the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem, that kind of thing. They got more and more. Eventually, Jesus is revealed as the Messiah, right, by John the Baptist. And so you have all this sort of revealing of the plan over time. And so you want to think about mystery that way, and not in this sort of, it was never known until boom, this person revealed the mystery. It doesn't work that way.
Mhm.
One of the really interesting usages of it is when Jesus talks about that the parables are the mysteries of the kingdom. And what he means by that is that he's giving partial information, but there's a hiddenness to it that you got to seek in deeper to get to the understanding, right? And that's a really good way of understanding that particular word. Does that answer your question?
Partially. I think you know where I was going with that. I was going to Ephesians chapter 1, but if you don't feel like dealing with that tonight, that's fine.
Yeah, we probably need to deal with that at a different time. Maybe what I'll do is after I cut the recording, we'll go there and look at it.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Trig's got their hands up.
Hey. Sorry, I was listening from afar. So one of the things I find really interesting about this, and I wondered if you could comment on a little bit, is the whole, the idea of hermeneutics as almost a reflection of our own character, right? Because they were this kind of like, in the same way someone would have the attitude towards hermeneutics that you kind of described in your own journey, sort of. Well, okay, so let's go back to your analogy of like the being in love with your bias kind of thing, right? And how if you're in love with your bias, it creates a natural blindness, right? And so I'm just thinking it's interesting because in a way, if we have the right attitude about our character in general and how we should be as people, as Christians, as Christ followers, right? Humble, open to deal with difficulty and challenge, and willing to put ourselves in positions of vulnerability rather than always being self-focused and self-protecting. It lends to having an attitude of openness towards self-correction and being found to be in error about something, and that leading to the opportunity to actually find the truth, right? And so there's this kind of interesting dividing line I find where it's like someone's hermeneutical approach, if you get into a conversation about that, can reveal some of their kind of heart character at the same time. Because if someone is very rigid, unbending, not even willing to discuss with you mode of looking at the Bible, it probably indicates that they have something going on in the character as well, from having a true relationship with God, even potentially, right? And anyway, on that subject, it's kind of hard for me to verbalize, but I feel like there are, because there's situations where people, I'm breaking up. Sorry, can you hear me better now, or is that just the?
Yeah, actually, that's a lot better there. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I forgot.
I mean, I could understand what you're saying, but it was kind of a little coming and going.
Sorry. So anyway, the question, I guess, to get your thoughts on, John, is because there are situations where people can genuinely disagree without being in that like poor character, so to speak, state of their hermeneutical approach, right? Where it's like you can just have genuine, well, it might be that, it might be that, but this is the way I look at it, where there's just kind of that those reasonable unknowns. And then there's the other side where people just will argue against logic and reason because of whatever the bias is. And I just wonder if there's like a handful of specific attributes that people demonstrate that we can kind of determine if we're dealing with that kind of problem quickly in an interaction with somebody. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let me do this in three parts. The first part is absolutely that it definitely reveals character, and I'll prove that in Acts 17:11, right? That the Jews in Berea were more noble than the Jews in Thessalonica, right? It was a hermeneutical difference, and it reflected the character difference between them, right? So absolutely, that if you have particular ways in which you interpret, it will definitely reveal your character, such as my way is right and everybody else is wrong, and I'll burn you at the stake if you disagree with me. Definitely reveals your character. And so the second part, I do think that I think there's probably some really good ways in which you could pretty quickly get to what kind of character does this person have? Do they have more of that Berean character, and you can have better discussion with? And I think one of the probably the better ways of doing that would be if you've got a subject at hand in which there's a difference between you, is to ask the question, it either like this is Kenny Willenberg's question. If you were wrong, would you want to know? So that's a good question. Or another question would be, what would you have to see in order to be convinced that your position was not correct? And the way in which they answer those questions, that will definitely tell you whether or not you can have those kind of conversations with that person. Because if they come back with I was just listening to Dale Tuggy's interview with the guy that Inti was talking about, who works on the REV translation now. And so this is really fresh in my mind. That running into people who you say, well, would you want to know if you were wrong, or if what would it take for you to be wrong, for you to say, oh, I was wrong about this, and they come back with a, well, I just know I'm not, I mean, that's not going to happen because I know I'm not wrong about this. I spent enough time with this. I feel it in my heart, whatever they say, right? That, okay, probably don't need to go any further with that person, right? But if they come back with, well, I don't know, I'd have to think about that. And I guess, if I saw some verses that blah, 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 okay, well, now maybe this is somebody that I could have that kind of conversation with. The third thing I was going to say about this is scholars in the past few decades appear to be getting better at setting aside their bias and utilizing really good hermeneutics. That whole science is building in a way in which it's why progressive covenantalists and progressive dispensationalists are largely on the same page. Because here's the deal. We're all dealing with the same data, right? And if there's enough data, which is really another point, if there's not enough data, then you get into, you have legitimate differences, right? Because there's not enough data to, maybe a little bit of data, but just not enough to be sure. That But if there is enough data, if you're using proper processes of hermeneutics, and you're very clear about what your choices are in that process, it's a lot easier to get on the same page. And because you're going to come to, I'll put it this way, you're way more likely to come to a correct conclusion in the interpretation that way. And so what you have is, rather than a long time ago when everybody's just kind of interpreting the way that they want to, and just doing things however they want to do it. And you talk about like Martin Luther, for instance, starts the Protestant Reformation and introduces a gospel that's absolutely wrong, because he's interpreting things that Paul is saying without any idea of the cultural context and what the phrases meant. He's just interpreting it based upon his own thinking. And so when he says, works of the law, he has no idea what Paul really means by that. And so he interprets it completely wrongly. Well, we have enough information now, we have enough expertise now in terms of this stuff, that the people doing the hard work in academics these days, biblical theologians and things like that, more and more they're coming together. They're all seeing the same things, because they're all utilizing much better processes of interpretation.
That's very encouraging for the future of.
I absolutely I think we're not very far away from the overturning of the Trinity in Christianity, because you talk about lack of data. There is none, right? There's no data for that. And there's data that gets used for the deity of Christ, but there's zero data in the scriptures for the Trinity. And so, I think it's just a matter of time. In fact, I read a book recently by N.T. Wright, and I could see he had everything he needed. He's talking about it. He just needs to connect a couple of dots, and boom, he's got it.
Wow.
And so we'll see what happens. All right, let's wrap up the recording. If you have stayed, we're at 88 minutes, something like that. If you have stayed this whole time, kudos to you. If you didn't walk out of the room after 10 minutes, I'm proud of you, and I want to be your friend. And
I sleep once.
I definitely encourage you, build your skill set in this stuff, right? Don't, if you believe that the Bible's, from God, make it an important part of your life to learn how to better understand and interpret it. And even if you don't go as far as some people go and they get their PhDs, so you don't have to do that. But especially if you're interested in a particular subject or a particular book of the Bible, you can learn these things, and you can utilize resources of people that are providing all the detail behind the cultural analysis and stuff like that. Really good commentaries these days and that kind of stuff. And you can get much better at your own interpretation. So thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.